General, to handle those challenges that you faced here at SAM so early on in your tour, you must have called upon your whole life's experience, and I would guess the time that you had in NASA was helpful in giving you some preparation for that. What do you think the Air Force in turn returned to that organization during the Apollo and other phases?
Well, having just spent 6 years on detached service with NASA, with every living day being very much involved in manned spaceflight, I certainly brought a strong interest as an Air Force officer and commander here to SAMSO of interest in pursuing the manned space arena within the Air Force and ultimately for military purposes. That view, which obviously was influenced by my experience, was not widely shared within the Air Force at that time. In the latter 60s, and I think it was while Secretary McNamara was still Secretary of Defense, I think, the Air Force's Manned Orbiting Laboratory Program had been canceled. And of course, in those years, while MOL was being pursued here in the Air Force, I was watching and involved only very peripherally, being very much fully involved with the Apollo program. So it was quite a blow and a disappointment to see the MOL program canceled. So when I then was assigned out here as commander, I was very much motivated to try to find the proper rational basis for reestablishing the Air Force's involvement in the manned space program in some proper way. Then, as before then, and even to a large extent up to now, there has not been a clear role for military man in space, nor a clear military requirement for manned presence in space. There have been a number of developmental, supporting, and related kinds of roles that have been defined, but none that have been sufficiently strong or clear to justify the expenditure of the large sums that would be required. So I think quite correctly, in a top-level military requirement sense, there was not a program for manned flight. But at the same time, thinking of the national situation, the program being defined on the civil side to follow on to Apollo and was the what became the Space Shuttle. And as NASA took the initiatives to define the shuttle program and to secure its approval, there were efforts which I personally supported and the leadership of the Air Force supported to have that be a joint interest program on the Air Force's part, sufficiently that the Air Force would participate to some degree in the development of the shuttle, and ultimately, to the extent that the shuttle presented military capabilities that could be justified in a military sense, it would then be used by the Air Force as a manned space vehicle. So I was very much involved in and instrumental in setting up the relations between SAMSO and the NASA centers, and participating in the higher level activities that went on in Washington of interagency coordination. And early in the planning stages, the Air Force saw the utility of the shuttle based on the then projected cost projections to utilize the shuttle for launching certain of its payloads into polar orbit, and that then became the basis for the facilities that ultimately were constructed at Vandenberg for Air Force utilization of the shuttle. I think in later years, this is later than my duty here as commander, or even as in later years as commander of the Systems Command, some major strategic mistakes were made in the way of decisions at the top of our government. I think it was a major strategic error for this country to commit all of its civil as well as military missions to one launch vehicle and none other. And that was the shuttle. That was I call it a national strategic error to put all the eggs in one basket. And I and many others opposed that decision. Now, as I look back on it, and have many times, that clearly was politically motivated. It was motivated as a way to get the money with which to pursue the development of the shuttle. The judgment then being that multiple programs, including continuing with unmanned or expendable launch vehicles, would take money that would be devoted to the shuttle's development. But nevertheless, recent years have proven the fallacy of that decision to commit everything to one vehicle.
Now, General, some people would have characterized that era, the decision-making process you were talking about, as a NASA versus Air Force era. That's not the way I hear you portray that. Did you ever sense a difference of...
Yeah, very definitely. Very definitely. There were strong elements in the Air Force adamantly opposed, and I think correctly so, to committing everything to the shuttle. NASA, on the other hand, with strong motivation to pursue the development of the shuttle, argued strongly for that everything be committed to it to justify its continued development. So there was a very, very major cleavage that developed. That would have been probably into the 80s. This was after I retired from the Air Force that the majority of this occurred. And even up to today, up until now, 1989, there are still important vestiges of that Air Force versus NASA that influence the course of events. And I think that's a national problem. Which brings me to one other element that I brought from NASA into SAMSO in the early 70s, which was a recognition of the tremendous capability that NASA had as a technical organization. And through its programs and expenditures for oriented to developing technology and doing research related to space, I thought it was important for the Air Force and NASA to work cooperatively in these science and research and technical development areas, to establish good relations between laboratories of the Air Force and centers and laboratories of NASA. So, and we did that. So I pushed our people, in other words, to take advantage of NASA technical capabilities and to be willing to make available Air Force developed technologies which could be made available within the bounds of national security, recognizing that some elements of technical developments going on under military sponsorship had to be protected in a highly classified way. So technical coordination and cooperation was another important element of that I tried to bring. I'd like to talk for just a minute about Air Force involvement in the Apollo, which takes us back to my involvement with the Apollo program. Remember that I was assigned there at the end of 1963 as one officer and was given the responsibility in NASA as a NASA official for directing the Apollo program. There were a few officers from the Navy, Army, and Air Force assigned in a few positions within NASA. Most of the astronauts had come from the military services. There were a very small number of other officers in various positions. A couple that come to mind are Rocco Petrone, who had been an Army officer, Army Ordnance officer at Redstone Arsenal. So as an Army officer, he initially joined up with the von Braun organization and later went with Kurt Debus, who was part of von Braun's organization, to establish the Cape Kennedy Space Center. And Rocco then retired eventually from the Army and continued as the key official there at the Cape, responsible for the Apollo launch operations. But fairly early in my time within NASA, I saw the need for additional help with experience in managing large programs. And I had sized up my responsibility and my job as the Apollo program director, recognizing that NASA already had a tremendous technical capability. The thing that was needed was an overall structure of management which would permit that tremendously capable technical organization of multiple organizations and centers to be able effectively to interrelate and effectively to interrelate in turn with industry that had to interrelate in order to make all of this ultimately come together. And to me that required a sufficient system of uniformity of approach in defining requirements, developing plans, developing the structure of budget and financial management, the technical structure for system engineering and system integration, involving specifications, the process of progressive design reviews, the process for developing a deep progression of testing, starting with components and winding up with qualification demonstrations. And the requirement for talent and experience in how to structure an organization and establish the processes by which it would all work in order to carry out all of this were just not existent in NASA. Some elements of it were, but to a large extent they were not, because NASA was a very new organization and its whole heritage had been on research and development.
Its very nature was bringing a number of smaller organizations together at any rate. So,
Yes.
yeah.
So very quickly I developed a picture of what I needed in the way of experienced people, and went back over to the Air Force and met initially with General LeMay, who was the Air Force chief, and fairly rapidly he delegated that to his staff, and fairly rapidly then we worked out an agreement that caused the assignment of initially 52 Air Force officers to NASA. And I assigned those, some within my Washington program office, some at Huntsville, some at Houston, some at the Cape, but all in an interrelated organizational structure of program project management.
These were not technicians then?
No, these are, well, they're not technicians in a technician sense, but they were people who had had experience in managing programs.
Leadership?
Example, yeah, leadership and leadership in a broad sense, but experience in structuring and managing large technical programs in a more direct sense. An example was General Ed O'Connor, who had been one of my associates here in the missile program. At one stage, he had been the program director for a program that was called the MMRBM, Mobile Mid-Range Ballistic Missile, which was one of the programs that never reached operational stage here. But Ed was assigned at Marshall Center to report to von Braun, and responsible then for structuring the Marshall organization in a project program sense. And I had on my own staff one of the key people that had been with me out here, who was a real pro in configuration management. So one of the first documents that we set out to write with Jack Colopy, his name, responsible, was the configuration management manual. That was the heart and soul and the foundation of system engineering management that had emerged from my experience, and still is, for that matter. So the point I wanted to make, though, is the direct involvement initially of me as an individual. Within a matter of weeks, some 50 additional Air Force officers put in key positions. And ultimately, over the some 6 years that I was assigned there, we wound up with of the order of 400 Air Force officers assigned in largely in management positions, a few in operational or technical positions, but the majority were in management positions distributed throughout the headquarters and NASA structure. So in that sense, the Air Force made a major contribution to the accomplishment of the Apollo program, and in a sense that I thought was important, I think the Air Force leadership thought so too. All of those people were then were acquiring direct experience in matters that most of which they wouldn't have had the opportunity to develop experience with.
Ultimately, you developed enough experience to take command of the systems ultimate in the Air Force Systems Command. But en route to that, you had another offline job. Tell us about that unusual assignment.
Well, you're referring to the period from 1970, 72, period starting in 72, 72, 73, when I was the director of the National Security Agency. The National Security Agency is one of the top intelligence organizations of the United States. It reports directly to the Secretary of Defense, the director of the National Security Agency, and has two broad missions. One is to provide for secure communications for all elements of the United States government, and to provide the means and the mechanisms and the securities and the disciplines required to ensure secure communications, military, State Department, everywhere in the government. And the other element of its mission is broadly called signals intelligence, which in simple terms means the intercept of all means of communication, and the derivation from that of intelligence. And that both on the communications security side and the signals intelligence side, of course, is very highly involved in codes and ciphers and cryptology. And I personally believe that there is not an organization anywhere in the world that is more proficient in its mission than NSA. But so that's the broad mission of NSA. It's a very large organization. It's headquartered at Fort Meade, but it has a very large number of people that are located around the world. And it is then the principal organization in the Defense Department for those elements of intelligence that are derived largely from that means. It's a partner, in effect, with the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is part of the Defense Department. But it has a national role which relates directly to the CIA, and is in that arena then one of the key participants in our national intelligence apparatus, and has been involved over many years now very much with the so-called national means systems, the national level observation kinds of systems. And since here in the Space and Missile System Organization of the early 70s, our organization and I, as a part of it, were very much a part of developing and supporting the systems that are key to NSA. Again, I became known to people in that world, and again, without any initiative and even without my knowledge initially, I was invited in one day to have a meeting with the Secretary of Defense, and it turned out to be a job interview by Secretary Laird then. And so I was selected to head the National Security Agency. That was a fascinating experience. That organization is so important to the national security of this country. One of the major challenges of that job was the inter-service aspects. NSA is a large organization in its own right as a defense establishment, with a national mission that couples it outside the defense arena. But one of its well, a big part of its manpower comes from its responsibilities for operational direction of the components of the Army, Navy, and Air Force and Marine Corps, which have counterpart missions in those services: communications security and signals intelligence. So what was in those years the Air Force Security Service was an operational subordinate element of NSA. And so I wore two hats as the director of NSA. One was the director of the National Security Agency, and the other hat was as chief of the Central Security Service, which meant the operational role of responsibility for the operational direction of the Air Force Security Service, Army Security Agency, Navy's security element, I've kind of forgotten the word, which had as a part of it the Marine element. And of course those services had many assets for that purpose, like ELINT, electronic intelligence, and mobile platforms, land, sea, air, fixed stations, various parts of the world. So it was a considerable challenge to plan and be responsible for the operational direction of the inter-service elements.
At a very high level, too,
Yes.
with a great deal of visibility to the national leadership, I would think.
Yes. One of the means of coordination of that was to invite the commanders of those three services in once a month for a breakfast meeting. Started with breakfast, and we usually carried it on through most of the morning to discuss the requirements, the times, the priorities, and progress and problems, and to work on our intercommunications. It was pretty effective.
You made another transition following that to a job that I must imagine was one that you very much look forward to, and that was commander of Air Force Systems Command. Talking about organizational transitions, so that had to take a transition to establish that job.
I was fortunate and very pleased to be assigned as commander of the Systems Command. This was in the summer of 1973, and of course with that promotion to the 4th star. The Systems Command by 1973 was the full spectrum acquisition organization for the Air Force, and responsible for research, development, procurement, production, the whole acquisition range. We, within the Systems Command, had the major divisions: aeronautics at Wright Field, space and missiles here in California, electronics up at Hanscom, armament down at Eglin, the Flight Test Center at Edwards, and so it was the full spectrum organization. We had a structure of 11 or so laboratories in Systems Command at that time, headed by a director of laboratories on the command staff. I think that there's been some change in that organizational structure since. The important programs of that time were the B-1, the B-1 bomber, the F-15 fighter, which became operational in the time that I was commander of AFSC, and incidentally was the last of the Air Force airplanes that it was my privilege to fly before I retired. Tremendous airplane, tremendous capability. Undoubtedly then, and even still, the best fighter in the world, most capable. The F-16 we'd been through a period of prototype development, which was already on the books when I became commander. It involved a competitive prototype program involving Northrop with the F-17 and General Dynamics with the F-16. And the original concept of those programs was not necessarily preconceived at the outset as being that one of those would be picked as the winner and then carried on into production. They were both undertaken as developmental prototypes to, in the case of the F-16, to develop fly-by-wire technology, which in the F-16 was the first major operational airplane that is controlled entirely by electronic means as opposed to direct cables. Both the F-16 and the F-17 had experimental objectives of the caliber that I've described. But during my tenure as Systems Command Commander, the requirement for a fighter aircraft, again, that was affordable. And the comparisons then were with the more capable and more expensive F-15. And the F-16 emerged from those studies and as being the F-16 prototype became the basis then for what was then pursued on into mass production, including co-production for the NATO countries. So some F-16s were, and perhaps still even still are, being produced in Europe. So that was an important program. The Maverick missile was in an advanced stage of testing. The A-10, the ground attack fighter, was in a advanced development and initial stages of being turned over to Tactical Air Command. We were involved with final stages of perfecting that Gatling gun as a tank killer in the nose of the A-10, which incidentally we were starting. I think of it as starting experimental development on Gatling guns for airplanes when I was at the Armament Laboratory in the early 50s. So in the early 70s, it was, I think as far as aircraft employment is concerned, that was the first application in the A-10. But the Maverick missile, which was IR guided, was in the operational stages. We were pursuing concepts that were somewhat different than the traditional armament concepts of hitting. You know, you typically the classical historical approach to bombing or even gunnery, for that matter, has been circular error probable and achieving a certain percentage of your hits or impacts within a prescribed aiming range. But we were in the early stages of laser guidance and being able to guide ordnance directly to hit targets. And that, of course, has evolved rapidly and extensively since then. And much of a lot of the munitions thinking I think of today is based more on extremely accurate guidance and being able to guide to direct hits. So that, which was in the early stages of development in the early 70s, is more nearly the norm now. Here we are in the late 80s.
Well, there was a great span of programs you were involved with. If you had to choose that which you think you're most proud of during your time at Systems Command, could you point to an accomplishment, a program, an initiative, and say, I really remember that fondly as a
Well,
big success?
I would pick one that went through I'd pick the B-1, even though it went through a later stage of cancellation by the President later. The B-1 program was in my judgment and in the view of, I think, the majority of the other top leaders of the Air Force, was a key critical program for the future of strategic deterrence and to replace the aging bombers, B-52 being the predominant one. So as the commander of the Systems Command, I worked directly with General George Brown, who was then the Chief of Staff, and with the other commanders of the Air Force in a way to fully assess the Air Force's judgment of the requirement for that airplane. And it was unanimously agreed that it was essential as a major system for the strategic defenses of the United States. So that was point one, which is to recognize the importance and to assure that the leadership is fully behind it. And point two then was to make certain changes in the program to ensure its success. And the B-1 program in that period, this now being the 73, 74, 75 period, certainly by 1975 was just in solid shape. It was developing well. It was making progress on schedule and was doing its things were getting done within the budget. Unfortunately, later, and this was after I retired, President Carter made the judgment that the program should be canceled, and it was. And then, as we all know, later, President Reagan brought it back to life, and it's now operational, and they're almost finished with the production of the airplane. So that's one that I, in spite of the later cancellation and of at least the highly publicized difficulties that apparently occurred in the latter stages of development and production. In the mid-70s, that was a good program and was in good shape, and I took considerable pride in it.
I was going to ask you at the same time if there was a disappointment during your time as Systems Command Commander. Was there a program, a project, or an event that you would have liked to have seen gone differently? Or?
Well, the disappointment, in a major program sense, was inability to reach reach a decision within the Air Force on the future of the intercontinental ballistic missile program. In the mid-70s, the Minuteman 3 was the key program and was very effective, but there was increasing concern, increasing every year, about the ultimate vulnerability of fixed site missiles. There had been studies for years on various modes of mobility, you know, the shell game, and gosh, all manner of studies were accomplished. One of the satisfying events of the time was an air-launched Minuteman. That's probably not well known or not well remembered, but it was a weekend, I think it was a Saturday morning, that I got a call. I was in my quarters at Andrews from General Brown, who was in the Pentagon. He was I think by then he'd moved up to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Sort of forgotten now whether he was chairman or still chief. But he said there were important reasons at his level for us to demonstrate some significant new capabilities in the strategic arena. What could we do? We were on a secure phone, and I suggested that the one that came to mind most immediately was an air-launched ballistic missile, which would be something new and dramatic and innovative. And in effect, he said, "How quick can you do it?" And I'm sure I hedged my answer a little bit, but I said we could do it rather quickly. It turned out that 24 hours later, I had General Ken Schultz and a couple of his key people there in Andrews, and we were discussing the beginnings of a project to launch a Minuteman missile from a C-5. And I have to refresh my memory a little bit, but I think the time schedule that General Brown could allow was something like 60 days. So between, well, Ken Schultz really is the one who made it happen, but he obviously had a lot of backing, and so was able to take a lot of shortcuts within the bounds of propriety and legalities to rather quickly get the job done. So we actually air-launched this was not something that was done from scratch. There had been studies of that going all the way back to when I was director of the Minuteman Program, for that matter. But we had a hardback structure to maintain the rigidity of the missile, and pulled it out of the C-5 with a parachute on the hardback, and it was in effect suspended then vertically and ignited and programmed to propel itself on a ballistic trajectory, and it worked. Of course, we knew it would. So that's one that was satisfying in many respects. It satisfied a national need that related in some way to international negotiations that were going on at the time. It demonstrated that even in spite of the masses of red tape with which we had to work in the mid-70s, that given the national need, we could still get something done in a hurry and do it effectively.
That's comforting. It must have been about this time that you gave some thought to a follow-on job to the Systems Command job. Is there an Air Force job that offers more satisfaction or more closure to a career than Systems Command Commander? And how did you look at the career progression at that point? What was taking place in your mind at that time?
Well, from the standpoint of my career, the position as commander of the Systems Command was the ultimate assignment. The only positions beyond that, of course, are the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and that position was well occupied. And the Air Force has a policy which it's followed fairly rigorously since its formation in the 40s, of mandatory retirement at 35 years promotionless service. And I reached 35 years of promotionless service in 1975, and that then was my quote mandatory retirement age. I might add, it's perhaps interesting as a historical footnote, that those of us who came into the service during World War II were given what was then called constructive service after the war. And the purpose of that, this action being taken back in the late 40s, I guess, was to kind of smooth out that so-called World War II hump, the large influx of people into the military services during World War II. And so I was given roughly a year and a half of constructive service. Now that worked to my advantage during much of my career in that it placed me that much ahead, if you will, of in terms of longevity and promotion. But I had to pay for it at the end because I reached, because that counted as promotionless service. So it cost me a year and a half at the end in time that without that constructive service I could have continued to serve within the Air Force's 35 years and mandatory promotion policy. At the time and since, I've thought about that policy many times, and I think it's a good policy. The Air Force in particular, and the military services in general, should be a, quote, young organization. Their mission in providing for the defenses of this country require a degree of vigor and many other attributes that are generally associated with youth, or certainly not with old age. And so, on the one hand, there are many people, both enlisted and officer, who by 35 years of service have many years of very productive service left. But at the same time, there are quite a number of people who have gotten pretty lazy, or have gotten fat and happy and lazy on the job. So I think on balance it's a good policy, and I think on balance it makes for a stronger Air Force to follow that policy in a pretty rigorous way, and therefore maintain the upward movement of younger people, provide for openings for younger people, and provide for the general atmosphere of youth and vitality that I think is essential. At the same time, the Air Force is able to call on its retired hands to the extent that that's appropriate or useful. Those of us who are retired are available at the beck and call of the Air Force chief or others that might feel that our experience or service would be of further use.
You mentioned that many end their Air Force careers with a number of productive years left. You certainly had several productive years left, and there were probably several people pursuing you to use those years with them, companies. And how did you make that decision? What have took place in
It was not an easy decision. As you can tell from our discussions here today, I was very deeply involved in procurement matters and contracts and with industry. Especially in the period up to my retirement in '75, the environment in Washington was very critical of the so-called revolving door. It was almost daily publicity in the papers of alleging conflicts of interest of people moving from top-level government positions, not necessarily in the Air Force or Department of Defense, into industry. So because of the roles that I'd had for so many years in major government procurement programs, I wanted to get completely away from business with the government, from involvement with the aerospace industry. I just didn't want to be exposed, either for myself or the company that I was with, to the barrage of criticism that was the general scene there in Washington. I want to come back and mention that because I think it's an important national problem still. But so that determination on my part to not be involved in government business or in aerospace then made it somewhat difficult for me to decide where to go, because I was being asked by key people in major aerospace companies to accept important positions with them where opportunities would be quite attractive. I also purposely looked at positions available in the non-defense, non-aerospace industry. I think I was really quite fortunate in that at the time, this now being the mid-'70s, there was much attention being given to the problem of supplying the energy needs of the country, and of the world for that matter. This was not too long after the formation of OPEC and the gas shortages and so on of the early 70s. So the national energy problem was high on the burner of people's thinking. And it appeared to me that perhaps becoming involved in some way in this broad energy question might be logical with my experience. And almost coincidentally, I think, with my thinking about that, I was asked by the top people of TRW if I would be willing to head a newly forming organization in TRW that was concerned with the development of alternatives to fossil, or to oil, really, oil and gas. And this amounted to using the tremendous coal deposits that we have in this country to make synthetic gas, and harnessing geothermal power and various other forms of energy and energy conversion. The offer that I had from TRW was to head this newly formed division of the company called Energy Systems Management, which I briefly outlined. And I accepted that position because it met my criteria for not being involved in the aerospace industry. It was the energy industry. Was not involved with government contracts at least in the defense arena. That position was developing over a period of a few months when an unfortunate death of an executive heading a different group in the company occurred. It was a group called the Energy Products Group that I was then asked to head. That group had as its business equipments and services to supply the oil and gas industry. There were some peripheral businesses which I led us out of, but the prime business was oil and gas equipment and services. And that very directly met all of my criteria, including no government business of any kind. We were dealing entirely with the oil industry worldwide. And so then for a period of several years, it was a very satisfying experience to manage a highly competitive industrial business supplying equipment and services to the oil industry on a worldwide basis, and building and managing plants in scattered parts of the world like Singapore and the United Arab Emirates and many other countries. So it was a tremendous opportunity and experience, and very satisfying. I think took good advantage of many years of experience in the Air Force and NASA in managing large enterprises. It had an element of commercial competitiveness, which I was not well schooled in the Air Force, but I rapidly learned on the job with TRW.
Let me ask you, if I may, about taking advantage of that experience that the Air Force gave you. A lot of people suggest that we ought to be able to take advantage of that, but a lot of people on the other side, in private industry, a lot of people on the other side say that really we have to be very careful that we don't have conflict of interest. Somebody in the military looking towards a job after retirement and maybe hedging their decision process. What's the right way to do that?
Well, I think that's definitely a major problem. I believe that it's a national disservice. It's a disservice to our national needs that people who acquire invaluable experience in government positions, whether they're in the Department of Defense or in other government organizations, are denied the opportunity to apply that experience in the industrial scene, where it so directly relates. They're either denied because of rules and regulations and laws, or discouraged because of the allegations of the appearance of conflict. And another dimension of that problem that I think is a national problem is that we have, by these rules and regulations and even laws, made it very difficult to attract into key government positions executives from civilian life and from industry that are so key to the direction of the departments of the government, starting with the secretaries and the assistant secretaries and within the Department of Defense. Surely there are many tens, if not even a few hundred, key civilian positions that are occupied by people who are appointed to those positions, generally with the change of administration, who then provide the key civilian leadership that is essential under our Constitution. And we've reached a point where it is very difficult, in my opinion, to attract the right caliber and competence of people into many of those key government positions. Secretarial level, assistant secretary level. And the unattractive, the things that make it unattractive to people are the prohibitions on what they can do when they leave government. So whereas 25 years ago, you could attract a person in his 40s in a key position in industry into serve as an assistant secretary of the Air Force for 3, 4, 5 years, and then he could go back to industry, and it contributed immeasurably to the gains on both sides. And you can't do that anymore. And I think that's a national disservice. I think it's a national problem. My own opinion is that the right way to deal with this problem is to start with the premise that most people are honest and that most people have sufficient integrity to deal with the true conflict of interest situations, whether it's coming into government, back to industry, or leaving government to go to industry, can deal with it in ways that are completely proper. And instead of starting with the premise that everybody's honest and basing the structure on the integrity of individuals, instead we've structured a situation which starts with the premise that everybody's dishonest, so we have to have rules and regulations that will detect all of this and prohibit people from accepting jobs of one kind or another on either side of this interface. And I think that's a major national problem. And I predicted now almost 15 years ago that we would reach a stage where the ability to, the primary people that could be attracted into these key government positions would be from the civilian sector, would be those who had reached the point of retirement, those who were in the academic world where this competitive aspect didn't apply, or those who had made a career out of government service one way or another. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that there aren't exceedingly good people in all three of those categories, because there are, but the thing we've denied is the majority of the population who have very relevant experience to offer to the government. So every year there are many people in the military services, Air Force, Army, Navy, who have through their careers developed experience that is very relevant and would be very useful in industry to pursue important national programs. And increasingly we're denying the opportunity for those people to take those positions, either by rules, regulations, and laws, or by the innuendo that continues to go on. So I don't know the answer to it, but it's a major problem, and I would far rather see us as a nation return to the fundamental premise that starts with a belief that most people are honest, and base our policies and procedures on that, as opposed to the opposite.
And thus be able to take advantage of these national resources.
Yes.
Well, it seems that the nation has done a good job of taking advantage of your resources while in the military, after the military, in a commercial setting, and even after retirement from TRW. You've been asked to come back and involve yourself in some very crucially important investigations to the nation. Tell us about some of those.
Well, after approximately 11 years with TRW, I reached my second mandatory retirement when I reached the age, magic age of 65. And that occurred almost simultaneously with the unfortunate Challenger accident at NASA, and the timing of President Reagan asking Dr. Jim Fletcher to go back to NASA as the administrator. I've known Jim Fletcher for 25 or 30 years, and he called me as he was in the process of being asked to go back to NASA. to ask if I would be willing to provide some help in the way of advice as to what should be done to get NASA back on the track. And although I was just retiring from TRW and was looking forward to pursuing very personal interests, I felt that if Dr. Fletcher could agree to go back in the national harness for an important problem, that the least I could do would be to be willing to help. And so at his request, I put together a group of about a dozen people to help, and spent much of the year 1986 reviewing pretty exhaustively the NASA structure, how NASA was managing its programs, and spending time at the centers, and as well as in Washington. And at the end of 1986, made a fairly extensive report to Dr. Fletcher with a number of recommendations of things that should be done in order to get NASA into a stronger position. The recommendations really were divided into three categories. The first category was how NASA managed its mission, which really meant its projects and its programs. And the second category was how NASA managed its institution, its headquarters and its centers, and their development and evolution. And that, of course, considered the elements of facilities, equipment, and people. And the third category was the executive management process, largely in the Washington arena, the administrator, his staff, and the relations then of the headquarters with the centers. The recommendations were pretty extensive. They're available in the public record, but Dr. Fletcher agreed with the recommendations and directed their implementation. And in the months that followed, many actions were taken to implement the recommendations. Roughly a year later, he asked if I would reassemble part of my original group as appropriate to take a look at the effectiveness of NASA headquarters, and I agreed to do that. And in doing that, it really became necessary almost to take another look at how things were going in most of the areas that I'd dealt with the first time around. So in late '87, I made that report to Dr. Fletcher, and again, he accepted the recommendations with one major exception, which is still on the books and I think is still important to the future of NASA, which is to make an organizational delineation between their research and development efforts and the programs for developing new capabilities to operate in space, and their operations activities, the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, continuing operations, largely related to the manned program and the shuttle, and to effect an organizational delineation and a management delineation between R&D acquisition on one hand and operations on the other. We don't want to go further into it now, but I think that's an important national need for NASA. I believe that Dr. Fletcher agrees, but felt that with the change of administration coming up early in '89, that he would leave that for his successor to be concerned with.
The method of determining our direction in space, is there currently, in your belief, a decision-making process that can determine what direction we're taking and then propel us towards that direction?
No, I think that's another national weakness. And I think it was one of the fact that we as a nation don't have a clear goal for our national space program is in many ways a root cause of other problems that appear. In other words, we as a nation don't really have a long-range objective and goal that we're trying to accomplish. And I think that's a weakness. And there are a number of reasons why we don't have it, not the least of which is we don't have an effective mechanism for reaching that kind of decision. If you will, decision machinery that's been in effect for the last several years has recognized that there are a number of agencies in the government that are involved in the space program one way or another. On the civil side, many years ago, it was NASA only. But now, in addition to NASA, there's the Department of Commerce, there's the Department of Transportation, and of course always the Department of Defense is a major related player. And the mechanism that has operated for the last few years to coordinate the interagency activities has been called SIG Space, Senior Interagency Group Space. And my own opinion is that it's been largely ineffective, and that if you will, the parochial interests of the several departments have not been effectively dealt with in an authoritative way by an authoritative organization that can I think properly and effectively plan national objectives, goals, strategies, and the means of accomplishing those, and then in a proper and authoritative way issue direction to the various departments of the government for who will play what part in carrying them out. The structure, I think, has been very ineffective in doing that. The new president, President Bush, has announced his plans to reestablish the National Space Council to be chaired by the Vice President. That goes back to a mode that started under President Kennedy with then Vice President Johnson heading a Space Council. I personally think that was a more effective mechanism than what we've had in recent years. It has its shortcomings, but President Bush has announced that's his plan. My own view is that it has a much higher probability of being satisfactory and successful than what we've been living with. Another part of the problem is difficult relations between the executive department and the Congress. And there are lots of reasons for that, but the Congress, particularly in the House of Representatives, has tried to take various leadership thrusts to define what the future of the space program should be, and often not in concert with what the executive department in NASA has been pursuing. So that's a difficulty. So the two elements I think have to be dealt with. One is the leadership in the executive department, which hopefully this reestablishment of the Space Council will move in a positive direction. And that in turn then would more effectively deal with the interactions with Congress, where ultimately there has to be agreement.
General, pretend with me just for a moment, if you will, that there's not an Air Force Lieutenant Colonel sitting in this chair, but there's the Vice President of the United States, the head of the National Space Council, and he comes to you and says, General, you've had a lot of experience in this area. I need to know from you, entering into this job of mine new, where do we need to spend our resources now in space? Our money, our people, our talent. What direction should we take as a nation?
My answer would be along the lines of continuing to give first priority to the national defense needs, to giving high priority on the civil side to the pursuit of development of technology. I might preface that, or intercede to say that over many years now we have neglected the development of technology for space application, both in the military and in the civil side. So I think that needs to be reestablished as a high priority. I would counsel vigorous efforts to define a national space program, this now on the civil side, that in turn could be embraced by, first of all, would be accepted by our president as his program, could be embraced by Congress as the correct national program for our country in these times, and then sold to the people as what our space program is, so that we define long-range goals, objectives, and where it is we're trying to move. I would recommend that action be taken to enable the NASA centers to be strengthened by bringing in additional high-caliber talent and people.
Military members?
Not necessarily, wherever they might be available. But in order to do that, there has to be something done in the federal structure. They're not going to be able to attract the talent that they require under the standard structure and civil service related rules that they operate. There are different approaches to that, many of which we discussed and dealt with in my more recent reviews of NASA. One is to give NASA, or certain parts of NASA, certain exceptions to the regulations and rules that govern various parts of the civil service structure, which would enable the attracting some of the talent that they need. Another approach that's been discussed more widely in recent times is to move in the direction of converting some, or ultimately perhaps all of the NASA centers from purely government organizations to being government-owned, contractor-operated, or some form that would approximate JPL, for example, as a contract, something of that kind. I would feel in a program sense that we've got to take a position in this country on the space station, which is the current new and still somewhat new program on the books. My own advice would strongly be to pursue its development vigorously. And I guess the final point I would make is that The NASA budget has to be structured consistent with the task that is expected to carry out, and that it's fallacious to accept a larger list of tasks and programs than the budget to support them. And I stress that because over many years now, there's been a tendency to do just that, to accept a list of programs with inadequate funds and then cut corners and stretch programs out, and that shouldn't be done. And I think the attitude ought to be that here's the definition of a program that we're going to pursue, whether it's in the manned arena or in the science arena for planetary exploration or Earth exploration or whatever. Agree on a sensible program and then carry it out only if the monies are provided with which to carry it out. Don't stand on short budgets and take shortcuts and wind up with problems that you pay double for later. We've done a lot of that, and we shouldn't do it anymore.
Sounds like you've got some good advice available for a president or anyone else who will ask. That doesn't sound like the mind or the thinking of a retired individual. What kind of retirement do you have now? What are you looking forward to in these years?
Well, I'm looking forward to some reasonable balance between, I'll call it public service, which is being willing to respond to appropriate requests for involvement in important national programs. Some balance between that and spending time with my family and pursuing some of the interests that I keep putting off year after year, like fishing and spending time with grandsons. And I'd like to, I think it's important to continue to be involved to the extent that those currently responsible want my involvement or involvement of others of my category. I feel an obligation to continue to provide as a public service to the extent that my experience is useful.
General, you talked about a lot of people who contributed to your success throughout your career, from the time you were in high school or junior high school, really, and throughout your career. What elements do you think it was in that involvement that caused you to be the success that you were in your career?
That's a bit hard to answer in the direct way. I think there are many aspects of it. One aspect is an older, more experienced person providing some push in a constructive direction. I saw quite a bit of that during my school years, which is, you could think of it in another way, it's an element of leadership, if you will, an older person taking an interest in a younger one. And
did that cause you to believe in yourself? Did it cause you to have some confidence?
I think there's an element of that in it. Yeah. Yes, and it certainly caused me to pursue higher education, which I might otherwise not have pursued.
Have you found a way to return this kind of inspiration, leadership, belief to others?
Well, I hope so. I've been involved now for many, many years with the Boy Scouts. I've been a member of the Los Angeles Area Council of the Boy Scouts off and on ever since I was commander of SAMSO out here, starting in '69. And through that, I've had some opportunity to provide opportunities or perhaps some motivational kinds of things for young boys. Probably closer to home, I've spent a lot of time with my 4 grandchildren in the last few years in particular, and hope to have some influence on their lives.
When in your career would you have been able to say to someone who asked you what you thought about being a general officer, being a major commander, when in your career did you see that that was something attainable, something that you thought you were qualified for or should do? Or did that point ever come until it was given to you?
I'm not sure that it ever was on my mind as something that was attainable, in the sense that I think you asked the question. But it prompts me to say that from my thinking, I think really from when I was a second lieutenant, that I always thought in terms of keeping the avenue to a full career always open. And to, I think I was always mindful and aware of any career moves that I might have felt would be constraining or would in some way deny me the opportunity to go to the very top. So I've always had in mind, not as an objective or I'm going to reach that position someday, but rather the attitude of not knowingly allowing any roadblock to ultimate success stand in my way. The subject of career development, career planning, career development, personnel development is, to me, a very, very important aspect of leadership and management. I think in the Air Force, and for that matter in other organizations, that those individuals who look to their organization to plan their career for them are making a mistake. I think it's up to each individual to essentially do his own career planning and to take advantage of the career development opportunities that arise. Now, I think properly done, that often coincides with what a good organization is doing in the way of creating opportunities and of doing career broadening, career development kinds of thinking and programs that ties in with individual thinking and desires. That maybe is a hard way to describe the subject, but I think good organizations create opportunities and career development tools for good individuals, and I think good individuals largely plan their own careers and take advantage of career development opportunities, and largely then are available when the next big step opportunities come along.
You talked a lot about the people whom you were able to find and put into positions of some responsibility that were successful, that helped you propel the organization. How did you select those individuals? What do you look for in people that...
Well, looking for people for key positions, my general approach over the years was to look for an individual with demonstrated professional competence and whatever other capabilities involving leadership or other elements that were essential to a key position. So in general, my approach was to find people with demonstrated competence and qualifications and capabilities. During much of my career, I had a fairly wide knowledge of people, and it was frequent that I was able to identify one or more individuals who potentially were properly qualified to be a program director or a general manager at some level or commander. So there's that key personnel selection process that I've been describing. Now, in addition to that, I think in the Air Force it's absolutely essential that there be a continual influx of new blood and new people and new talent, which is coming from professional development organizations and universities and service schools that's offering quality opportunities and education. So you're continuing to build a broad base of capability and talent.
What role did your family play in your career? You talk very fondly of your grandchildren. You have children as well.
Yes, my family obviously played a very key role in my career. We talked about the the early part of it earlier. We our second daughter was born in Germany, incidentally, while I was stationed at Frankfurt. She is now an engineer with the office business systems development organization of Xerox, computers and related equipment. We had a third daughter, born somewhat later when I was stationed at Wright Field. So our family, my wife and I, consisted of 3 daughters. Those 3 daughters traveled the world with us and had both the benefits and the penalties that go with frequent moves and changes of schools, and but they learn a lot about the world, and it's, I think, been to their advantage. We've had a good family life. They've always been very much involved with where we are and what we're doing. Most of the jobs that I had were quite demanding in terms of traveling. So one of my regrets is that I wasn't able to spend as much time with my family as I would really have liked to have done.
For everything that we do, it's said that there's always something we can't do. If you were starting out again, perhaps embarking on a new career, but knew you couldn't be in the military, couldn't be a general, couldn't be involved in space, what sort of career do you think you'd pursue?
An industrial executive. Back when I was in college and before the war and everything else made it pretty clear what my initial career would be, I was highly motivated to get a job with one of the major electronic companies. They weren't called electronic companies of the day, but RCA, Westinghouse, General Electric. I'd been interviewed by all 3 of those before the war broke out, and I was kind of angling for a position with RCA, Radio Corporation of America. That would have, and if I had in 41 or 42 wound up in one of those positions, which could well have occurred, I think I could see myself in one of the top corporate positions that paralleled where I wound up in the Air Force.
But we can't forget that the Air Force has been an important part of your life. If you were advising someone just starting out in the Air Force about how to make a success, how to contribute to the Air Force, what do you think you would advise?
The Air Force, I think, is a great organization. It has a broad range of fine and exciting opportunities for young people, and for that matter, for people who aren't so young. I think my advice to a person in an early stage of their career would first of all be do a good job in what you're doing. I think that it's important to have a meaningful job, and to have a job that causes something to happen or produces results that are recognized and important. So having an important job or a useful job is important. Those who feel somewhat dissatisfied in that respect, I think, ought to go talk to their boss. If they feel that they don't have a real job or that what they're doing isn't important, I don't think they ought to sit and stew about it to themselves. I think they ought to go talk to their boss.
Or send a Western Union telegram.
Well, I'm not sure I'd counsel that at this stage, but talking to your boss is important. And then, as I have already said, to repeat myself, do a good job in what you're doing today. Try to keep your options open for being able to move on to the top level positions. And there are no roadblocks that I know of that prevent people who are specialists in missiles or space as opposed to flying airplanes. There have been a number of four-star positions that have been filled by people with those qualifications. So try to keep the options open and at least be mindful of allowing roadblocks to career progress from impeding your opportunities. You know, from the hours we've been talking here, it seems that the period starting in the early 40s has been a period of exciting opportunities, rapid development, and many exciting things. But if I were in my 20s in 1989 or 90, I think I could see an even more exciting time ahead with opportunities and challenges and that are terribly important nationally, to the world at large, and to people in general.
General, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I've certainly learned a great deal. It's been fascinating. I thank you very much for spending the time.
Well, JB, you've been a very professional and patient interviewer. We've taken a long time, and surely in some parts of our discussion I've taken more time than I might otherwise have been able to do, but I'm glad we did it. It's been enjoyable, and thank you for your professional approach here.
Thank you very much. We've been talking to General Samuel C. Phillips, one of the Air Force's pioneers and one of the men of the United States Air Force. Thank you, sir.